The Crazy Times with Jack and Eddie continue. Chapter 6: Career Decisions. Middledale Stamp and Seal was located in a small, outdated district in urgent need of gentrification in the east side suburb of Middledale. But while the area was a bit seedy, the location on 15th Street proved more than adequate, allowing easy access to the freeway, the Air Force Base, and the local college. Jack's dad, Denny, owned the strip mall that housed the Stamp and Seal shop, sandwiched in between Denny's typewriter shop on one end and the Skyrocket bar on the other. As proprietors, Jack and his younger brother Dave couldn't have been offered a more lucrative opportunity, given the relatively hostile business environment amid the current economic downturn. The overhead was virtually non-existent, thanks to Denny, who supplied everything they needed to run things, including a rent-free lease and utilities. He even brokered generous government contracts with the Air Force Base, promising to fulfill all future rubber stamp and notary seal needs for years to come. Yes, the Stamp and Seal shop had all the makings of a successful business venture. Still, Jack and Dave viewed the enterprise as transitory. Eddie was now almost 6 years removed from graduating high school, and still no closer to obtaining a degree of any kind. In fact, he had dropped all classes from the previous 2 semesters without gaining any credit at all. He was scholastically adrift, hopelessly derelict upon a vast sea of uncertainty. He had lost all direction in the midst of this great tempest, with no star or shore to anchor him. Somewhere along the way, he had unthinkingly cast his academic life overboard, along with his confidence and self-esteem, and his academic goals had hit rock bottom. He had spoken to several of his more trusted coworkers at Methodist Hospital about career options. One of the pharmacists suggested he move to Saudi Arabia, where pharmacy technician jobs were not only available and tax-free, but profitable, paying twice the salary he was currently making. But the disparate culture seemed too drastic an option for Eddie to even consider. Another coworker said that the only way to make money was to open a business, proffering that no one would ever get rich working for someone else. It seemed she spoke from personal experience, as her husband owned his own pharmacy, and she lived in a mansion in one of the most affluent sections of the city. He thought of Jack and his brother, owners of Middledale Stamp and Seal. They certainly weren't rich. Besides, Eddie knew nothing of business, nor had he the capital to launch any such venture. It just seemed like too much of a responsibility. Yet another pharmacist coworker suggested Eddie marry into money, and while this option held merit and great promise, it seemed rather unrealistic that he would be so lucky. The only girl he had been with since his breakup with Mary was Elizabeth, a young nurse at the hospital from back east, who seemingly had taken the job at Methodist for the sole purpose of finding a husband to begin a family. She was unworldly in love matters, far too naive to have yet been jaded by the antics of faithless scoundrels who might seek to steal her innocence. And while Eddie had no intentions of playing a lead role in her long-term plans, he was willing to mark time with her until something better came along. While Eddie contemplated these career options, he thought of Jack. He was one of the worst money managers Eddie had ever known. It seemed he spent his money on all the wrong things, yet he always seemed to have it to spend. What he didn't spend on beer, he spent on cigarettes. And what he didn't spend on cigarettes, he spent on strippers. His advice on money was this: "Don't worry. We'll have money when we get old. It just takes time, and poof, you got money. It don't matter what you do or how you spend it. Just look at my parents. They live in a nice house in the suburbs. My dad has a swimming pool in his backyard. He goes to Vegas 3 times a year. He has a refrigerator full of beer all the time. You think he knows something we don't? Nah, he's just older. When you get to be our parents' age, you just have money. This logic, while completely groundless and even borderline absurd, was somehow hard to ignore in the face of the body of evidence he presented. It certainly had a ring of truth to it, Eddie thought, as he pondered his own parents. They live in a nice house. They have nice things. They take vacations every year. Hey, they have it made too, just like Jack's parents. It was an epiphany for Eddie. Not only that it takes time to accumulate wealth, but that Jack, and Jack alone, had figured this out, and as the custodian of this secret truth, was sharing it with him. This thought shook Eddie back to reality as he exhaled heavily, letting loose a cloud of stifled tension that served to soften his career anxiety, at least for the moment. Yes, he was comforted by this new understanding, but still, he needed a plan for the future, just in case. Perhaps Jack had insight on career options, he thought, realizing that a visit to Middledale was in order. It was after 11 p.m. when Eddie left work at Methodist Hospital. He opened the door and climbed into the Monte Carlo, quickly noticing that the seats were sopping wet. Eddie had recently adopted Jack's reckless habit of not locking his car door or rolling up the windows while leaving his car unattended. Jack deemed this practice senseless and bothersome, figuring that a thief would find nothing of interest in such a jalopy anyway. Actually, it didn't even take a key to start it, as the wing key lock mechanism on the steering column was broken. Still, Eddie hadn't counted on an afternoon thunderstorm, and the rain not only had soaked the seat, the saturated carpet swished disagreeably under the soles of his shoes. He reached up, turned the ignition, and the engine cranked to life. But when he glanced at the fuel gauge, he groaned audibly. A quarter tank. He was fairly sure it would be enough to get to Middledale to see Jack, and then on to his shanty in the north suburbs with no problem. But he knew he'd need some gas before payday. The next 2 days would bring high scrutiny as to how and where the few meager dollars, currently in his possession, would be spent. It was not a problem to be solved tonight, though, and he steered the car through the parking lot and onto the avenue toward Middledale. Eddie pulled into the dimly lit parking lot in front of Middledale Stamp and Seal and parked next to Jack's pickup. He killed the engine and looked around warily, spying a solitary man smoking in front of the Skyrocket bar next door. He turned to look through the front glass of the stamp shop, but the business was dark. Eddie presumed Jack would be in the bar anyway, though it was not uncommon for Jack to be at the shop any time of day. After a moment, Eddie hopped out, immediately aware of his wet clothes clinging snugly to his backside. For a full minute, he danced and shook around the gravel parking lot in a futile effort to dry them before finally giving up and making his way into the Skyrocket bar next door. The bar inside was simply one big room, dominated by a green felted pool table in the middle of the room, flanked by several cheap tables and chairs for sitting. The bar took up one whole side on the right, with small restrooms beyond. To the left, just inside the door, stood a jukebox, currently playing George Jones, and past it was a window air conditioning unit whose noisy whine nearly matched the volume of the music blaring from the jukebox. Eddie made his way to the bar to order a beer, but Jack jumped up and interjected loudly to the barmaid. "His money ain't no good here." He laughed as he patted Eddie on the back with a friendly stroke. It was obvious that Jack had already had several beers, most likely having been at the bar since he closed the shop at 6. Eddie gladly accepted his friend's charity, aware that the cost of this beer was an extra gallon of gasoline. The barmaid planted the frosty can on a paper coaster in front of Eddie, who straightaway hoisted the beer toward Jack in celebration. A generous gulp followed that landed graciously in the bottom of his satisfied belly. A pleasant-looking man looked on from his right, and the two of them smiled in cordial regard. He was older, balding, perhaps in his late 40s, but Eddie seemed to sense a remoteness in his dark eyes. Whether it was out of curiosity or mere politeness, something in his smile beckoned him to keep smiling back. So Eddie did, even as the discomfort of it mounted to what most would consider a disturbing level, even a frightening level. The interaction continued, as the two men smiled pleasantly without breaking gaze or even saying a word. Jack looked on intrigued, but he, too, appeared to recognize the unusual nature of this odd discourse. Then, just before Eddie had gathered the courage to look away, the man's face flashed from a friendly smile to a serious glare. So sudden was the change in his expression that Eddie's smile disappeared too, and his face now conveyed something between puzzled shock and fear. The man glared at him for a moment, then started to speak. "You forget to take them clothes off before putting them in the washer?" The man deadpanned. He was referring to Eddie's wet clothes, but he never lost eye contact with Eddie. Eddie nervously stared back, trying to piece together his cryptic question with his predatory body language. No creepy smiles now, just plain scary. Jack interjected to lighten the mood. "Homer, this is my buddy Eddie. Eddie, this is Homer." Eddie nodded hesitantly, hinting a smile, but Homer didn't blink or look away. His was an almost vacant, ribald stare, devoid of any semblance of hidden pretense or civil decorum. Then suddenly, unpredictably, he flashed immediately back to that creepy smile again. This time, Eddie was more reluctant to reciprocate. Whether he was confused or simply choosing to more closely guard his emotions, there was now an obvious disconnect in their interaction. "Much obliged. Any friend of Jack's?" "Is a friend of mine." Homer seemed normal again as he smiled a genuine smile at Eddie. And just as Eddie began to smile back, as if a switch was flipped, Homer's expression went dark again. He peered deep into Eddie's frightened eyes, not unlike that of a cat and a mouse, menacing, threatening, intimidating. He leaned over to Eddie and said in a low voice, "Now don't forget to take them clothes off when you put them in the dryer." He kept a straight face for 3 full seconds before erupting into a loud guffaw. He looked away as he grabbed his beer and tipped it straight up, gulping down the last few swallows before plopping the bottle back on the bar. Eddie took this opportunity to disengage, and he and Jack retreated in the direction of Jack's table in the rear of the bar, happy to be released from Homer's bizarre reality. "Yeah, that guy is spooky. Did you see how he looked at me?" Eddie whispered as the two of them sat down. "Who, Homer?" "Oh, he ain't never given me no trouble. He saw action in Nam. I think he's got a screw in his neck and a plate in his skull." Jack motioned to an area in the back of his head. He tapped a Marlboro from its package and raised it to his mouth and lit it, all in one motion, as he'd done 1,000 times or more. Jack was very brand loyal when it came to his cigarettes, and all the time Eddie had known him, he'd never seen him smoke anything else, unless he ran out and was forced to bum a smoke from somebody. He was this way about his beer, too. Jack was a creature of habit in many ways, though he'd take exception to being called predictable. "So, Eddie, been thinking about going back to school. You know, I talked to a guy who said funeral directors make a lot of money. There's a funeral service program at the university. I checked it out, and we got almost all the prerequisites out the way. All it would take is 2 more years, then it's all gravy." Jack took a deep draw from his cigarette, leaving the words suspended in the smoky air for Eddie to absorb at his leisure. Certainly, there was a lot to process here. Eddie recalled the only funeral director he ever knew, Mr. Worthy, who lived in the small town where he grew up. Though he didn't know him personally, Eddie remembered a pleasant fellow in a dark suit, driving around town in his shiny black Cadillac, ever cordial, with a smile and a nod as he passed. He had an elegant wife and two stylish daughters that were quite popular in the local school system, and they all lived in a beautiful home on the edge of town. Yes, it seemed to Eddie that they were a model family living the American dream. Jack's idea certainly held promise, and it seemed to be the best advice so far. Actually, that sounds like a pretty good plan. Eddie mused hastily, with seemingly light regard for how such a decision should be made, or how it might impact the course of his life. But it was a plan forward, and knowing that Jack would be there with him as his classmate made all the difference. Jack offered an agreeable chuckle, perhaps at Eddie's abrupt approval of the idea, but more likely it was a proud laugh elicited by Eddie's blind faith in his advice. They finished their beer and walked out into the muggy night air, leaving Homer sleeping head down on the bar. As they approached Jack's pickup in the dimly lit parking lot, Eddie didn't even notice that his car was missing. It wasn't until Jack asked him where his car was parked that he realized. Perhaps it was the silence that distracted him from his vigilance. He looked around the empty parking lot, dumbfounded. What the? Where's my... Who? Eddie quickly ran the scenarios through his mind before finally grasping the situation. Initially, he was outraged that someone would violate him that way. Jack chuckled, as if Eddie were playing some elaborate prank, but his smile dissolved as Eddie continued. Of all the nerve! Eddie immediately suspected the solitary man who was smoking outside of the bar when he had arrived, though he had no clue who he was. Perhaps he could ask inside the bar. He pictured him hot-rodding around in his Monte Carlo all over town, perhaps holding up a liquor store, then dumping his car in a ditch when he realized the seats were wet. At least he could take some solace in the perpetrator's wet ass. As he ruminated further, trepidation crept into the equation. He began to wonder about liability when explaining that he left his car doors open with windows down, and how his car could be started without a key, or how the half-smoked joint in the ashtray might play into the investigation. Suddenly, the situation had become complicated, and reservations mounted about what to do. Let's go inside the shop and call the cops. I'll go get us a six-pack from next door. Jack unlocked the door to the stamp shop and turned on the lights, and Eddie called the Middledale PD while Jack stepped next door. Eddie had never called the police for anything in his life, and his only encounters with them were negative in nature, having been ticketed or harassed for any number of traffic violations when he was younger. Still, Eddie viewed the police as authority figures, and justice was their job. The officer came, took information, and then left, stating that cases like this often took days or weeks to resolve. But midway through the last beer of the six-pack, the phone rang. The officer had apprehended the suspect only a mile and a half away. The Monte Carlo was no worse for wear, as it sat on the side of the road, illuminated by the police cruiser spotlight. Eddie gave the car a cursory inspection, then signed the paperwork the officer had prepared. The extra time had allowed for the seats to somewhat dry out, and the cops left almost a full six-pack of Budweiser in the front seat, courtesy of the late-night joyrider. Even the joint in the ashtray went completely undetected. Eddie smiled and turned the key, musing that locking a car was actually a pretty good idea after all. He waved at Jack and watched as his pickup pulled away and bounded up the freeway on-ramp. Tomorrow, they would enroll in Dead School, and the next chapter of their friendship together. Chapter 7, Dead School. It was the first day of the fall semester at the university, and Jack and Eddie were registered full-time in the funeral service program. Coursework included orientation to funeral service, embalming chemistry, history of funeral service, and microbiology. As they arrived for their first class, there was a palpable optimism between them, though for completely different reasons. Eddie's failed attempt at a career in music was now behind him, and here was his chance to purge all the guilt resulting from the underachievement of the last 6 years. He viewed this fresh opportunity as a blank canvas on which to paint a masterpiece of redemption. Salvation was his for the taking. Jack was no less inclined to resume his own scholastic endeavors. The stamp and seal shop was never really anything he had wanted, nor was it a career he had ever envisioned for himself or his brother, Dave. Their father had meant well in facilitating the business venture, but they never solicited for it or fully appreciated it. For this reason, funeral school offered Jack an excuse to distance himself from the business, while still drawing a paycheck there. And while this arrangement worked well for Jack, it only meant that Dave would now be doing more work during the hours of Jack's absence. This was by no means a new development, as Jack often came and went from the business at his leisure. Many times he was brazenly overt in his truancy. It was not uncommon for him and Eddie to show up in golf attire mid-morning, take some cash from the register, and then disappear without even a word to Dave, who continued working as he had done all morning. Dave seemed to take it all in stride, but his reticence on the matter spoke volumes about the resentment he felt for having been treated that way. This happened often enough that whenever Dave saw Eddie show up with Jack, it was unspoken code that Jack would not be staying to work that day. That Eddie never even knew or considered how much Jack's work ethic affected Dave was truly a testament to Dave's easygoing and affable nature. Jack and Eddie quickly became acquainted with their classmates, a class of about 25 students, of which 2/3 of them were men. Many of the male students were openly gay, as was the professor and the dean of the department, though he was much more discreet about his orientation. Perhaps many in the class mistakenly assumed Jack and Eddie to be gay too, given their friendship and close fraternity. It didn't stop some of the more curious women in class from finding out, however, and a forthright, blue-eyed blonde made it a point to sit down next to Eddie just as the lecture started. It was her scent, her wonderful scent, that announced her presence to Eddie. It was a soft citrus aroma full of musty pheromones that coaxed him to look her way. And when he did, she smiled receptively. Then she opened her notebook and scribbled something before pushing it forward for him to read. "What's your name?" "Mine's Audrey." He looked down at very feminine handwriting, and the sentence was punctuated with a beautifully drawn heart and a smiley face. He looked up, their eyes met, and he was struck dumb by the bluest eyes he had ever seen. Her seductive smile was captivating and inviting, even bordering on predatory due to its innate candor. The clarity of her intent caused Eddie to flush and his heart to pound, but he did his best to keep his cool as he turned his attention back to the note. He laid his hand to the paper, holding his pen with a slight tremor. "Hi, Audrey. Just call me interested. Love, Eddie." He wanted to laugh at his own wit, but when Audrey saw it, she laughed for him, and her strident giggle filled the classroom, followed by neck-breaking head snaps from all directions. The professor paused for a long moment and frowned sternly with taciturn disapproval, then sighed indignantly as he turned back to continue his lecture on the funeral customs of Upper Appalachia in the mid-1800s. Eddie did his best to look innocent and uninvolved, but Audrey covered her mouth animatedly while stifling her laughter, and offered no pretense whatsoever to anyone who had witnessed it. Then she wrote again. "I have to go to meet someone right after class, but my address is 2106 Whistle Stop Road, Yukon, Oklahoma, 405-555-2121. Come over tonight? 6:30? This time, two hearts followed the request. Eddie looked over and nodded, trying not to look too anxious. Then she gathered her books and left the classroom before the lecture was even over. Jack looked on from Eddie's other side, aware that Audrey had been flirting, but he hadn't been able to read the notes. When the professor dismissed them, Eddie filled him in as they walked to their next class. Did you get a load of that girl? Her name is Audrey. Got a date with her tonight. Going over to her house, I guess for dinner. Maybe dessert, too. Eddie laughed, raising his eyebrows knowingly. Excitement was palpable in his voice. But Jack didn't say much. Eddie knew how Jack loved women, so his lack of enthusiasm seemed a bit out of place, especially since Audrey was the prettiest girl in class. For the first time since Mary, perhaps a relationship might progress from this date. Admittedly, he knew nothing about Audrey, but if looks and body chemistry mattered, then this just might be what he was looking for. He turned to Jack. So, what do you think? She's awful pretty, you gotta admit. Eddie looked to Jack, who reached in his pocket for a smoke, lit it, and took a deep draw before exhaling thick smoke into the hallway air. She all right. Jack didn't look at Eddie, but continued. You see, Eddie, she just ain't my type. She got blonde hair, blue eye, white skin. I like brown hair, brown eye, brown skin. I just don't know what you see in her. A few moments of silence. Jack finally looked at Eddie to read his reaction, but Eddie was still processing. It was certainly crazy to think that any heterosexual man wouldn't want to have a go with Audrey, simply based on her hair or eye color. After all, she was really attractive by almost any metric. Would he kick Farrah Fawcett out of bed? Jack's logic was contrary to the mainstream opinion here, and his unwillingness to see Audrey's allure seemed contrived at best. Certainly, Jack's opinion was important to Eddie, but in this matter, it was almost as though Jack held other motives. That evening, Eddie arrived on Whistle Stop Road promptly at 6:30. He'd been driving around the neighborhood for at least 15 minutes, trying not to be early and appear too eager. It was a nice charcoal-colored brick home, no more than 10 years old. As he stepped up on the porch, the front door flew open before he even rang the doorbell, and the mouth-watering aroma of fresh garlic bread and spaghetti sauce spilled out into the October air. Audrey had on a red polka dot dress and looked more fabulous than Eddie could have ever even imagined. And she took his hand and led him behind the door as it closed. The meal that her mom made was just as good as it smelled. Throughout the course of the evening, Eddie learned that Audrey had lived in Houston, was recently divorced, and had moved back to live with her parents and attend funeral school. Her parents were nice, but when they said goodnight and went off to bed, dessert was nicer. They got on well, and when Eddie got up to leave, she invited him to help the next night with a haunted house that the funeral department was sponsoring for Halloween. What a night it would be. The next day on the way to the haunted house, Eddie saw a roadside vendor offering a dozen cut roses for $10. He thought of how impressed Audrey might be when he gave them to her, so he stopped and bought them, leaving him a few dollars in his pocket. He wondered if he could afford them, but figured that payday was coming at the end of the week, and he had enough gas in his tank of the Monte Carlo. He chose to buy them, and he placed them neatly in the back seat and sped on his way, full of elation, yet completely unaware of how the night would ultimately unravel. He pulled into the parking lot, got out, and closed the door, peering into the back seat at the flowers one last time. He figured he would give them to her later, at the right time, when the moment could be better appreciated. And as he approached the haunted house, he decided to slip in the back way so as to be less conspicuous, owing to the fact that he wasn't well acquainted with most of who would be there. The room was one big party of volunteers, drinking beer from brown paper sacks and sitting on metal folding chairs. There, at the center of attention, was Audrey, sitting in some stranger's lap, laughing, as she tilted her head back to finish the last swig from her can of beer. Eddie bristled a bit, but when she noticed him, she staggered to her feet and sloppily introduced him to all who were there. Someone gave him a beer, and the party went on, as Audrey made her way back to the stranger's lap to continue the story she was telling prior to his arrival. There didn't seem to be too much volunteering going on, he thought, nor did Audrey seem to care much about whether he was there or not. He sat down, but didn't socialize much, trying to piece together the puzzling thoughts that were racing through his mind. After sitting for 30 minutes without a bit of attention from her, he swallowed the last of his beer and slipped out the door to the parking lot. He jumped into his car and slammed the door angrily as he sat for a minute, trying to understand the events that had just transpired. He started the car and drove across the street to the liquor store where he spent his last few dollars on a pint of Old Crow whiskey. He sat in the liquor store parking lot, opened the bottle, and took a big swig, planning his next move. It was still early, not even 8 o'clock yet. If only he could talk to her and find out what had happened since the night before when they were so happy together. He decided that the best course of action would be to sit in his car, drink whiskey, and wait for her to come out. Besides, he'd spent $10 on roses. It would be a shame for her not to know that. So he drove back across the parking lot, drank his whiskey, and waited. He woke up in unfamiliar surroundings, lying across the front seat of his Monte Carlo, the near-empty bottle of whiskey and a brown paper sack cradled in his right hand. The darkness that enveloped him served to confound him further as he sat up and remembered where he was and why he was there, though the effort caused his head to throb. His watch read midnight 30, and as he tried to clear his head, he heard loud voices. It was Audrey and the stranger, walking to her car, arm in arm, still laughing as though they had never stopped. She fumbled for her keys, and the stranger helped her in before getting in on the passenger side door himself. Eddie's first thought was to follow them to see where they were going, but he didn't have to wait that long to find out. The car started, then jumped the curb of the parking lot and headed off into the dark pasture behind the mall. He saw the brake lights light up. He watched the car sit still for a full minute, and then the car lights went dark. The moment of understanding had finally arrived for him, answering any questions he might have had about their future together. Eddie smiled sadly and shook his head, then drove back home to his hovel in the north suburbs, feeling foolish for having thought he had even stood a chance. The next day at school, Audrey was a stranger. No longer did she sit next to him or even make eye contact. Of course, Jack noticed, which made it easy for Eddie not to say much about the split. Jack had more of an easy-come, easy-go approach when it came to women, where frequent one-night stands were standard operating procedure, and emotions, such as those with which Eddie was contending, seldom figured into the equation. But he could see that Eddie's lack of experience with regard to a vixen like Audrey could only end badly for all involved. As they headed to their next class, Jack offered some consolation. "You're better off without that bitch anyway, Eddie," he said with a hint of empathy. "You can do better. She's not pretty anyway. No brown hair, brown eyes, brown skin." Jack looked at Eddie for reaction, but received only silence. "Hey, they're having a Halloween party this Friday night down at Central Plaza. It's free. We'll go down and see what's what. You won't need a costume. At least, I ain't wearing one. What do you say?" Eddie confirmed with an apathetic shrug. But inside, a nagging thirst remained from the dying embers of the fire that Mary had kindled, a fire that Audrey had stoked back to life. For now, he could manage the fire, but as for the thirst, he was eager to quench it. The party was raging when they arrived, but they didn't seem to know a soul there. Eddie scanned the motley collective that filled the room, but it wasn't long until his eyes settled on a familiar form on the dance floor, impeccably dressed as Mozart. It was Audrey, and Eddie recognized her straight away. Suddenly, he felt conspicuous, noticing that he and Jack were the only ones without a costume. Eddie looked toward Jack for support, but he was already standing at the keg near the corner of the room. Eddie pushed his way through the maze of Disney characters and Star Wars villains surrounding the dance floor, finally reuniting with Jack, who, by now, was drinking a beer and talking to a girl in a genie outfit. Eddie filled a cup from the tap and joined the conversation. "Hey, this is my friend Eddie," Jack said proudly to the genie girl. Eddie nodded with a smile, which was met with a bashful glance away toward the dance floor. "Eddie, this is Tawny. She's in our orientation class." Another nod and another glance. Tawny was the quiet, studious type, seeming more mature and cautious than other girls he'd met. Though not a looker, she was pretty in a cute sort of way. But it was the ample cleavage bulging from her genie outfit that kept Eddie interested. So interested was Eddie that Jack's absence went virtually unnoticed. After 3 beers and more than an hour of conversation, Eddie paused and looked around the room, then looked at Tawny and shrugged. "Want to get some air?" Eddie asked, mainly as an excuse to look for Jack, figuring that he'd gone outside to smoke. And when Tawny nodded, Eddie took her hand and led her through the merrymaking to the back exit by the indoor pool. And just as he reached to open the exit door, he heard something familiar that made him stop. He followed the sound with his eyes as it echoed across the pool from the steamy hot tub on the other side. Whispered colloquy gave rise to stifled giggles and assorted laughs, and slowly his eyes focused on a playful couple through the fog. When he saw the Mozart wig, he knew in an instant it was Audrey. He watched her reach sloppily for her beer and spill it, then exposed herself after coming halfway out while attempting to retrieve it. It was then that Eddie saw her male companion. Eddie's eyes met Jack's, and as their gaze lingered, the moment crystallized, and their friendship blinked for an instant. An avalanche of answers followed a deluge of questions, but in the end, there were no excuses or apologies to be had, only memories. With that, Eddie turned and pushed the door open, and he and Tawny walked out together into the evening air. End section 4.